about the industry that you love, and why do you love working in this industry?
Question. I love how it's changing. A big part of my role has always been working with audiences, so it's how to connect content, whether that's film, television or games, with people like you. So a lot of the time it's the psychology of, I love the people, the hard work, the glamour side of it, the rosé, lots of rosé. Every day is never the same.
And for me, I think it's all of those things, but I would say that above all, it's this idea of making things happen, making things come true, really, in a way, inventing dreams. Because at the point when you start playing a film in your cinema, or you start putting a film together even, it's just an idea. And you kind of have to make that happen. You have to make it real. So somehow, it's an Indian rope trick. You're throwing the rope up in the air and then you're climbing up the rope. And that's an amazing feeling. Obviously, occasionally it doesn't work and you fall, and that hurts quite badly with a bad bump. But most of the time, you have an incredible journey, because it's always a journey of exploration. I remember that when I was a distributor, that the nerves before the Friday night opening of trying to work out whether we would catch the audience that we needed and wanted. And obviously, in a way, even more with production, where you're responsible for raising quite large amounts of money, and then trying to make that dream meet an audience that you can't quite hold. That's an incredible journey for any person, and always exciting.
And I think you mentioned the glamour and the rosé of film and TV, but I guess it can't all be glamour.
Oh, it's not. I think
so not. We have a bit of we see the Oscars and all the other award ceremonies, we see red carpets and glitz and dresses, but it's not all.
No, and it's we always say it's not a 9-to-5 job. That there are office jobs, but we're working at all hours. Festivals are weekends and evenings as well. It takes over your very soul. So the work is hard. You've got to love it to be in it, and that does balance the glamorous bits that you might see.
I don't know anyone in the business who does it just for the money. Literally. Yeah. I think it's always a passion project. And sometimes people crash and burn as a result, because they kind of are so obsessed with it that they forget to look after themselves, which is a danger. Yeah. So you have to look after yourselves. But by and large, the people you meet are really interesting. It's not. You occasionally read horror stories, and obviously the Harvey Weinstein stories had a lot of airtime. But most people in the business are actually intelligent, interesting, curious, like young people. Yeah. They like young people because young people are their audience, actually. So they're constantly thinking about, how do I engage with them? So it's not some horrible place to be. It's a really interesting place to work.
So on that kind of, Chris, obviously you've worked across lots of different sides of the industry.
Yeah.
What kind of roles have you had personally, and what have you worked on in the past?
Well, I made a terrible sort of career-defining mistake, because I started out as a film critic. I ran the Time Out film department, but kind of by accident. I became a critic when I was 21 years old. And by the time I was 25, I realised I'd made a mistake, because I was never going to make a film, because being a critic is the exact opposite of ever making a film. But I couldn't get into production, because production's always been, and still to some degree is, the sort of snobby end of the industry, and also the one where everyone wants to be. And so I started out by creating a small distribution label, and doing quite well. But that was just like me and a desk and a telephone and some money I borrowed. And then on the back of that, I ended up buying a cinema, and then another cinema, and then a third cinema. And then one of the filmmakers with whom I worked at the time was a really quite well-known art house filmmaker, came to me and he said, I'm really pissed off. He said, Channel 4 won't give me any money for my next film. And I read the script, and it had like extreme violence, cruelty, incest. Yeah, it also had Helen Mirren and Michael Gambon and Tim Roth, who at the time were not huge stars, but nonetheless. And I was really young and naive, and I said, I'll go and find the money for you. And that's how I got into production for the first time. So it took me quite a few years. And then, so I did that. And then I ended up building up a couple of businesses, one of which is still quite successful today, which is called Hanway, which is a big rights agency that sells films all over the world. So I've been in the muddy fields, holding the actress's hand, saying it's all going to be okay, don't worry. I've done that bit. I've done the standing at the cinema door, in Edinburgh, where I used to have a cinema, thinking, oh God, I hope the audience turns up. And I've had the sickening feeling of going to work on a Monday morning knowing that we just lost £250,000 over the weekend, which is an absolutely horrible feeling.
It doesn't sound good.
I've also had the experience, obviously, of phoning up the cinema on a Saturday night and knowing that we broke the house record, and that's pretty great. And owning a cinema or running a cinema is kind of not a million miles away from running a nightclub, because you can because you can feel the heat of the warmth of the audience and all of those people, and if it's going well, it's the incredible buzz, It's one of my favourite things, actually. When people say, isn't producing great? I go, yeah, but you're kind of mostly doomed to disappointment. And sometimes dealing with the actors can be really, really, really tricky. Whereas this buzz of being at the door of the cinema and seeing all these people smiling as they come out is just quite something.
Yeah, absolutely.
I recommend it.
So everyone should buy a cinema. Is what you should take from this. Maybe 3.
Or work in a cinema. I mean, people forget it's a boom industry, We live in a very digital age, but actually the cinema thing last year was a record-breaking year, right?
Yeah, since 1970.
It's the biggest year for movie admissions since 1970. Incredible, really.
Yeah.
And more cinemas being built.
Yeah, so there was something silly, like how many screens was there in the...
And another 40 cinemas, I think, was it?
Another 90 screens, so there's 4,399 screens in the UK, and that's 90 up from last year and 10 new cinemas from last year. So we hear a lot about cinema in decline, but actually people are still going. There's a lot more independent venues. People still want that shared experience that you guys are all having now. There's still a place for that alongside the disruptors, the Netflixes and the Amazons that we're told are sort of changing the industry dramatically.
I think that's also, that's happening also in places which you wouldn't necessarily think of as metropolitan sort of centres. So there are new cinemas opening in places like Banbury and Skelmersdale and Wakefield and so on.
Skelmersdale.
Yeah, I mean So I was in Rye in Sussex last year, and I went into the city. It's a very small, very, very old town. And there was this brilliant new 2-screen cinema. And I walked in, I said, gosh, this is fantastic. They said, yeah, it's the 3rd in our small chain. And I said, where are the other 2? And the other one was in Sussex, and the other one's in Bermondsey, just down the road. It's the Kino. And it's, they just, bit by bit, they're finding places where there isn't a cinema, where you can find an audience, where the council probably wants to help. It's not always just about huge amounts of money, actually. When we did the cinema in Edinburgh, that hugely was to do with me persuading the council to deny planning consent to somebody who wanted to turn an old cinema into a furniture warehouse. So actually, buying the site cost almost nothing. The tricky bit was raising a bit of money to get us from there to the point where we'd put new seats in and open the doors, frankly.
Yeah, I think particularly in cinema, the multiplexes are having to change how they cater for audiences, and that's why we're seeing a boom in the number of sites and screens, because people want a nicer experience. I don't know about you, but I like taking my glass of wine in with me, or the seats being comfier. The rosé, always.
Just a glass.
Just in my handbag, getting a reputation for myself. But people want that sort of nicer, more comfortable experience. So that's what the smaller independent venues are doing. So the food's nicer, the technology's nicer, and you can see the multiplexes, so your Odeons, your Cineworlds, your Views, your Showcases responding to that as well. So Odeon have their kind of Lux brand where you can eat while you're watching a film, which is actually very difficult. You can't see what you're watching, you can't see where it's going, so that's a bit crazy. And in Leicester Square, the new Cineworld had a big shiny revamp. So it's amazing. Yeah, it's a really exciting time, certainly for cinema.
It's also, I mean, what we think of as cinema and what we think is film has now become so multi-facing. I mean, the Oscar campaign around Roma has had some really unintended consequences. The rollout of the film into cinemas, which was not part of the original plan and was slightly, frankly, chaotic at various points along the way, they had to do it. They just realised that without that, they weren't going to get the lustre around the film that it needed. It wasn't intrinsically a commercial calculation. It has become one, but it wasn't when they started.
Absolutely, and that's something interesting to think about is with Netflix and the rollout of Roma being on your little laptop screen and then in the big cinemas, and the whole controversy with Netflix at Cannes Festival last year, where they didn't screen anything.
It got pulled, didn't it?
Yeah. Okay. But that's changing in this year, even a year later.
But they're having to, because as Chris says, they're realising the value of a cinema release in terms of the credibility and profile of a film, but also in its qualification for awards. So they're having to change, which is quite an interesting situation to watch when they've had an impact on our industry, and distributors and exhibitors have had to change. They're having to change. Whereas Amazon has always recognised the value of a theatrical release and really supports it, and that's part of their product acquisition strategy. So they spent £47 million acquiring 5 films in Sundance, and they have they want to release 10 films theatrically a year, 20 straight to the service. Whereas Netflix, it's 90 straight to the service, but they're going to have to adapt if they want awards and a sort of profile for the film.
And then if you look at it from the other point of view and you say to yourself, what happens in a cinema? I mean, when I had my cinemas, we just played movies. Now, I mean, that is clearly not, the case anymore. And, you have to think a bit about all of these equations are about sort of the way the culture generally meets business and meets people, and it's constantly like a piece of cloth. It's constantly folding and changing. So Nick Hytner, he's probably one of the best theatre directors this country's ever produced, and also no mean slouch as a no mean bad thing as a director of film. He said, "I grew up in Manchester in the '60s. If I'd been able to see Laurence Olivier's National Theatre at my local cinema, I would have gone all the time." Well, guess what he did? He and David Sable, his partner, invented National Theatre Live. And so that's, to me, on the course that I run, on the entrepreneur course, not the producing course, which is about making films, on the entrepreneur course, that's fascinating to me, because what drove them? What drove the start of NT Live? A couple of things happened. It's not unconnected with the financial crash, believe it or not.
Really?
Well, what happened was both the the Metropolitan Opera in New York and the NT here, their big corporate donors were people like hedge fund managers. And in 2008, the floor fell out from donation. They had to think of other ways to pull in some revenue. And both of those two houses, one of the ways they addressed that was by thinking about how they could get some of their production in front of a larger audience and make money out of it. And it worked really, really well. And they have made very significant amounts of money that they've ploughed back into the theatre, while happily satisfying audiences from like Dundee to John O'Groats, So culturally that's been fascinating. It's now theatre and other specialty products are now taking up, 15% of screen time?
Yeah, and it's something we look at on our course as well, that sort of vying for your attention as audiences. We're not just competing with other films, we're competing with theatre, opera, sporting events, this event cinema. It's taking out, like Saturday nights used to be the biggest night in cinema, and they're being taken out for theatre or opera.
I mean, last year, Secret Cinema, if you looked at the box office for UK, cinema box office UK 2018.
Have you been to Secret Cinema?
Has anyone here been to Secret Cinema?
Yeah. Does everyone know what Secret Cinema is?
Yeah.
Yeah? No? Okay, so who wants to explain? Okay, I'll try. I've never been to a Secret Cinema event. I know. It looks so fun, but
it's
expensive.
Maybe someone who's been.
Yeah, so for example, the Star Wars one, they did Return of the Jedi. They hired warehouse space. You get allocated a character before you come. I mean, tickets are quite pricey, about £70. But there's a big lead up to it. You're part of the resistance. You get messages. You get special codes to put on their website. You have to dress a certain way. When you arrive, you're in character. Everyone's in character, and you're led through. And they've recreated the kind of desert market set of the film. So there's people trading. You've bought stuff with you to buy things, eat and drink. And that's all before the film even starts. And then when it starts, they're reenacting scenes from the film. So you're watching it on the screen, and it's being enacted there, and there's stormtroopers.
So it's
incredibly
immersive audience game meets cinema in a live environment.
Yeah.
Quite pricey. And last year they did one event that was came in number 50 in the box office chart of all films last year.
Well, Romeo and Juliet, £3.3 million in 2 weeks. So that's 250 grand a night.
Oh my God.
And that's for a film that has already run its course. So they're sort of re-energizing films that have already run.
So we on the entrepreneur course, we look at that stuff like that because we're fascinated by how you take something that is not on the face of it, a commercial idea, but just going back to the point about culture, you know, I always say to my producing students, making films is not just about adding up numbers and saying, oh, how do I raise the money and get the budget? It's actually about thinking about taste, what people like, what they will do. And games culture, in a way, has been hugely influential in all sorts of other areas. I mean, just take, in the last 5 years, take on-street gaming, you know, zombie running games across cities. I mean, they've become really successful. Or take escape rooms. I mean, there's escape room games playing going on all over the cities in the UK. That's a real business. Do you know what I mean? And it's sort of next door but one to the cinema, and next door but one to theatre, and next door but one to sitting at home on a console.
And do you see this as because audiences are changing? So thinking about secret cinema, I was just thinking about I've seen hot tub cinemas and rooftops. Hot tub cinema sounds
I
horrible
know, that
to
just
me.
freaks me out.
And rooftop cinemas and
rooftop
where
one
you
in Peckham's
swim
great.
and then they've got a screen and
But it's like I
all
was
these
saying,
different...
this experience
Yeah.
around watching the film. We want more from a night out, and I think that's what's changing, to get your attention away from the quality stuff that's on television or from Fortnite. Don't get me started. We'll talk about that in a minute.
Yeah.
All the other things you could be doing with your social time or spending your well-earned money on, you know, as an industry, we need to give you more of an experience, and I think that's why those things are sort of winning.
Yeah. And actually on Fortnite, I think we were talking about this
floss.
briefly, the floss. I worked in a cinema before I worked here, and we showed NT stuff live, and they had huge audiences, always sold out. And then we had half term, the summer holidays, and we were fully expecting it to be rammed full of kids and families. Nobody there, completely empty. And I don't know whether you have, why would it be? Because everyone expected young audiences and families to come out to the cinema.
I mean, the sad thing about the younger audiences is we are losing, particularly the male audience, 9 to 11 years, 9 to 12 years old. We are losing them from film to Fortnite. I mean, I helped my friend with her 11-year-old son's birthday party a little while ago. And it was all about Fortnite. We thought we'd sent them all to bed. We sat up with a glass of wine again. Sorry, wrong impression of me.
It's a theme,
Really wrong impression.
gurgling through this seminar.
Yes, I'm clearly fueled by
Carry
it.
you home after.
Not yet, yes. Anyway, so we were there, and at 2 o'clock in the morning, they were sneaking downstairs to try and get back on it. It's like an addiction. It wasn't a nice thing to see. And when you
What
look,
was the Disney thing about that?
yeah, so Disney acknowledged for Incredibles 2 that they, you know, and that should have been a young boy audience, that audience has all but gone for them. And you look at the stats, so there's some ridiculous stat that's 564 million online viewers to watch somebody playing Fortnite. So to not actually be playing yourself, but to log on and watch somebody else playing. And that's what's happening with esports. You know, cinemas are entertaining the idea of just having on the screen people playing games, and then gamers will come and watch that. It's crazy.
That's
Sorry,
bizarre
I won't say that.
No, it's interesting because it's for somebody like myself, and I'm sure some people in the audience who think of the cinema as being an event and stuff like that. I would never ever watch someone else play a game on YouTube. But future audiences, these young people will be buying their own tickets to go to events in 5 years' time, maybe. So what kind of events and stuff will we be able to put on that will draw them into the cinema?
And it's going to get worse. So I'm all about the stats today. So Target Media Group released some figures about tablets, and this fact, it's 1 in 4, so quarter of under 5-year-olds have their own tablet.
Under 5?
Under 5 have their own tablet. So the parents are like,
So if you
I'm off.
so if you want to feel depressed, you think about the social consequence.
Yes,
and if you want to be optimistic, I say to my students, what animation could you do that would be fun and enjoyable and have an educational value but would also engage the kids? And in a way, you know, you have to be kind of non-snobbish about thinking that it's as interesting to please a middle-class, middle-aged crowd who look a bit like me, but it's equally good to please a 4-year-old who lives somewhere very, very different. What a fantastic challenge. You know?
And is the film and the TV industry responding to these challenges?
Yes, I mean, from a marketing point of view, so we're all about, on the course, we look at ways to engage, so whether that's social media planning, publicity, trailers, posters, it's about decreasing attention span. So, you know, I've got godchildren and they'll watch 2 films and a TV series at the same time across weeks, but they're watching 20 minutes here on their phone, then going to school, or 20 minutes here of something else. So the way we're marketing is changing, and you would see it in the trailers that you see online. We run almost like a condensed part of the trailer for about 5 seconds before the real trailer starts. It's called the thumb stopper, and it's to stop you scrolling. So you're going to see that more and more. So I think the way we're marketing is changing in response to that.
I mean, if you talk about the industry as a career option, I'm just to put some more numbers out there. So last year, film in the UK is about a £2 billion industry of production, and which makes it the second biggest hub in the world after LA, by a huge margin. And then high-end television, so television drama that costs more than £1 million an hour to make, is another $1 billion. So it's a massive. That is, if you took those two together, it's roughly £3 billion. That is double the size it was 7 years ago. So in terms of opportunity for people who want to make things, it's enormous. And that's not even talking about all the television formats and all the online stuff. So, and of course, it's not like some heavily programmed space where everyone knows what they're doing. Yeah. You know, my favourite story, and a person I particularly like personally, is a young Brit, black kid not kid anymore, but from London, called Dominic Buchanan, who's done incredibly well. And he made a short called End of the Fucking World. And then persuaded Channel 4 to get involved in it. That didn't quite work, and it ended up as a Netflix series and ended up being incredibly successful. And he came and taught on one of the courses we run. And I said, did they tell you how many views it got? He said, no. But I just know that, for example, it was enormous in Brazil because I had so many people writing to me offering to fund my next project from Brazil. Oh. So it's fascinating, you know, the sort of unintended, unexpected thing. That has kind of led him to a path where he probably will end up with a Brazilian business. Funny, eh? Yeah,
and I suppose there's a lot of talk of the doom and gloom of, the death of cinema, everything is going, everyone's just on their tablets. But that story shows that places like Netflix and Amazon, it doesn't mean that it's a death of cinema and that there's no...
I'd say as a producer at the moment, there's never been a more competitive environment around production finance because there are many bidders at the table. There's a slight risk of the system overheating, but you know, hopefully that won't happen.
Yeah. And do you think disruptors like Netflix, Amazon, even Facebook have started doing TV series?
Yes, and Snapchat.
Snapchat. Yeah. have they changed the way we watch film and TV, and have they changed the quality of output for the better, for the worse, and how it's consumed as well?
I think there's definitely been an impact on the quality of output. So television shows now, I mean, you've all seen it there, in terms of the talent that they're attracting. So they're attracting A-list stars from film and now doing TV in terms of budget. So The Crown was something like £13 million an episode. We're talking film budgets per episode of TV shows. So I think that is a huge impact.
I think there's a sort of paradox. So I think it's been incredibly stimulating and actually brilliant for some of our ex-students. So Laurie Nunn, who was a writing student at the school, for example, 5 years after graduating, she wrote and became the showrunner of Sex Education,
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And that's, that 40 million views in the first 4 weeks. It's an incredible success. And that would have been unthinkable 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So I think, but there's a paradox behind that, which is a huge amount of money going into production, a lot of very kind of fascinatingly wide range of production. If you think about the taste of it, the culture of it, it's not just one thing, which is brilliant. More people at the table with money, which is great. I suppose the one thing that is tricky about what we loosely call film, by that I mean film, however it ends up reaching its audience, is that you are living maybe the second generation that can totally make something for very, very cheap. And you would think that should make it possible for 1,000 flowers to bloom. But actually the marketplace is quite crowded by stuff that's quite expensive. So actually finding your way through as a new entrant is not as simple as it always looks. And that's a paradox.
Yeah.
Theoretically, the barriers to entry are very, very low because, the quality of what you can shoot on this is every bit as good as an old 16mm camera.
Yeah.
And you don't need any stock, so it's really, really easy to make.
But I suppose there are more routes in because there's so many different paths to take.
And the appetite is huge.
That's for the making of it.
That's for the making of it.
So my course and my kind of crusade is about encouraging people to look at what happens next. So there's a whole industry and business around getting your film, your TV to audiences. And I know a lot of content creators think that's going to automatically happen, that cinemas will automatically show my film, or that audiences will just come anyway because I've made it, literally because I've made it. But there's a whole business, some really exciting roles around making that happen.
I think that's where, the idea of this in a way relates closely to the world where social media drives a lot of activity, where it's something's a pilot for something else that becomes bigger, that becomes a phenomenon, and we're not just seeing that in film. I'll give you an example from theatre, which is an area I've only been interested in the last few years, but because of the entrepreneur course, but it's fascinating. So there was a Sweeney Todd production in a barbershop in Tooting, I think it was, 3 years ago. It transferred to the Fringe, then to the West End, and then to Broadway. Whoa. Now, the journey of that production is partly driven by the ability of people to go, that show was fantastic, and the echo chamber is helping that happen, and ultimately landing them up on Broadway, which is an extraordinary journey for the woman who produced that show, actually. The other side of it would be a piloting exercise like Dominic Buchanan doing The Short, End of the Fucking World. Channel 4 kind of nervously say, we'll commission a pilot, sort of nervously kind of start to produce it, and then they end up with, Netflix on series 2 now. So that it is that thing of, you're not just make something, can I have an audience, please? Yeah. It's, I'm finding my audience as I go.
As you go along, building
and I think that very much resonates with the world of social media, where some messages are listened to, others are not.
Well, I suppose as a filmmaker, if you've made your film and it's your baby, and then you're presented with this overwhelming world of different opportunities and different routes to go through. Just as a how would you start? Where would be a point to, if you've got no connections, you've made your piece, where would you go?
I mean, we always talk about, as Chris said, that journey where you're finding your audience as you go. That's part of the message. You start thinking about your audience as soon as possible. Do not wait till the film has finished, you've completed on the film. There's a whole raft of things you could be doing while you're making the film that are going to elevate the chance of your film's success in distribution, and that's building your audience on social media. So by the time you're finished and you're approaching distributors and sales agents, you can say, look, these people are engaged in my content. Here they are. And that's a gift. There's all the materials you could be creating when you've got access to the cast and the locations and the costumes. Do all of that, those materials, while you're making the film.
I mean, I think that's why self-making, if you like, low-budget guerrilla filmmaking and self-distribution, you don't do the former without the latter.
Yeah.
You know, if you take an example, like, has anyone here seen Northern Soul? Film that...
Even I haven't seen that.
Okay.
But it's
See
about
it.
Is it
See
great?
See
Yeah,
it.
it's
It's
great.
a lot of fun.
Okay.
And that was self-made and self-distributed, I think, wasn't it not?
Yes, well, they had a distributor on board that wanted to put that film straight to DVD, and the filmmakers weren't happy about that at all. So they used a model called Our Screen, which I don't know if you know. So
Anyone know that? How that works?
Our Screen.
You can book theatres and they will play the cinema as long as
50% of the
50
tickets are
are
sold.
sold.
So the audience don't get charged until that screen is 50% or more sold. The cinema has the security of knowing that it has an
And
audience.
50%
Yeah.
occupancy for a screen is good.
Pretty
Yeah,
good.
and that ran for months, that campaign for Northern
Yeah, they had
Soul.
hundreds of
Yes,
dates
it
as a
had-
result.
It had a box office that rivaled a traditional distribution platform.
All
Now,
through our
obviously, for
studios.
the filmmakers, that is an enormous amount of work. And, you know, there are people who say to me, when we look at the music industry, they say, you know, you look at what used to be called 360-degree deals, which is where the artist is at the centre and controls everything. It's great, except the artist, among the things the artist has to control are endless social media feeds and drive all that activity to engage their audience. And that, I think, can be a nightmare because, you know, but I thought the Northern Soul example was really good because it was about that specific film which had an audience of Northern Soul fans, and they found it, and that gave them, and they ended up with real careers.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this idea of self-distribution, is this something that is new to the film and TV business? Is this something that's been in other businesses previously as well?
Well, it's certainly not new to the publishing
I was gonna
industry.
say, yeah.
Okay.
I mean,
Self-publishing.
Vanity Publishing, as it used to be called, you know, colonels, my retired colonel publishes memoirs of my life at Indian Hill Station in 1920. You think of it as sort of a relic of the colonial past, really. But actually, modern self-publishing is huge. I mean, there were 1 million titles self-published with ISBN numbers last year, which is phenomenal. It's slightly in publishing. Actually, there was a boom and then a decline. Interestingly, particularly in the e-book market, and there are some very odd things have happened in the book world. The way that e-books appeared to be about to eat the entire book trade alive, and then suddenly the tide stopped. And Waterston's last year made a profit for the first time in many, many years, which is amazing. A good thing, by the way, very good thing.
Yeah.
Because without the retail, I mean, imagine cinema without cinemas. You know, imagine books without any bookshops. That's where that's where I come back to the word culture. You know, what kind of culture do you want to have?
Yeah.
So the self-publishing thing's fascinating because it's right at the junction of all of that. How much of it's good, how much of it works. I think film's an odd one.
Yeah, there's a place for it. The tools are there for you to distribute your own film. As Chris was alluding to, it is a lot of work. So I would say it's going to be like 9 months a year of your time, which is 9 months of a year where you're not making other films. So there's a decision there. You need to surround yourselves with a few experts, and you learn a lot through my course about who those people might be and the process. those kind of things. But it can be extremely rewarding because you get creative control over how your film looks and feels. You get the revenues that would normally kind of disappear into the either of distribution.
Yeah, I mean, if you compare self-distribution with conventional distribution, and you looked at where the money flows, it's radically different. I mean, if you looked at a cinema box office and said, "Here's £10 at the box office," what happens to the £10? It's amazing how many people have to take a share, not least the cinema, which takes about 70% of that £10 just to pay the rent and the staff. So actually that £10 filters its way up into tiny amounts of money. You have to have a really big hit in conventional distribution to make, you have to have a King's Speech style hit or a, to really make money as the originating producer. In the self-distribution market, where you are effectively doing all the jobs except owning the cinema, you're getting your hands directly on about 50% of the box office.
Yeah.
And you can learn so much about the process and what happens. So if you then go into traditional distribution, you've got all of that knowledge in your back pocket. You know how they're going to spend the marketing money. You know how to get the cinemas.
It hadn't occurred to me before, but it becomes more like putting on your own theatre show would be in amateur dramatic terms, where you know exactly how much you're spending and you can practically count every ticket that's sold, and you really end up with the whole process being in your hands.
Yeah, and I guess for a first-time filmmaker, it might be quite a good option to sort of get a feel for what the industry, the business is like.
And crucially, what an audience likes and dislikes can be shocking. You know, I mean, they really don't like that. It's kind of that you're learning. I'm not saying you always have to please all audiences, quite the opposite, but you have to know which audience you want to touch.
And does this work just for conventional cinema, or would this be a route for anyone that's thinking about going down VR or AR or anything a little bit left field?
I would say it's probably more tailored for that as well, because it's unconventional, so your audiences in those spaces are more receptive to it being given to you in different ways.
Okay, yeah. And things like VR.
I mean, that immersive thing is an interesting one. We've got an alumnus of the entrepreneur course who very successfully built a purpose-designed VR. You can't call it a cinema exactly, because obviously you're not all sitting watching a screen. A VR, it's almost like I'd say a VR club, a VR night, because you're experiencing it collectively, but it's a private experience for each of you. And that did really, really well. Whether that will ever scale up, IMAX have been trying to do something in those, So IMAX cinemas have invested in prototypes for doing that as an adjunct to what they do within the IMAX screens. I don't know. I mean, we're heavily involved in that. The school's just developed a £10 million immersive cinema centre.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and that's just started this year. And but the whole jury about what will happen with audiences around immersive, it's just, it doesn't feel like 3D, which is a kind of, it came, it cried, it went.
It might come back a bit with James Cameron.
Oh,
yes.
The next one maybe. Yeah.
Avatar 2.
Yes, it might come back again. But we did a nice tour of kind of the leading immersive experiences as part of our preparation for the centre at the school. And we were in a cinema watching a section of The Nun in 270 degrees. And it's quite effective. There was a trailer where we're in a car that's going like this, and you do feel it. But whether it's enough to sustain audiences for a long time.
Are these gimmicks?
Well, time will tell. And 3D does feel like it is a gimmick. We'll see. But it was.
I mean, sometimes it's just also worth saying. Sometimes the best ideas are just the simplest ideas. I mean, does anyone here watch Mubi or know what it is? Mubi, the online
I do.
Movie, like a portal. So for those of you who don't, it's Mubi was started by an inspirational guy called Efi Çakarel, who's Turkish, and who went to Stanford University, did a tech degree, and ended up at Goldman Sachs, the merchant bank.
Oh, really?
And he was a fintech guy, so he was like devising algorithms for the bank, you know. And then he was stuck in Tokyo airport one day, and he wanted to see a famous Japanese movie, In the Mood for Love, Wong Kar-wai's film, and he couldn't find it on his tablet. And he thought, this is crazy. I ought to be able to. I'm in the most switched-on place on the planet. I ought to be able to just have it. And so he started this online service called Mubi. And they went at it 3 times. They lost about $30 million along the way, and basically went bust because they were just trying to recreate a sort of TV station, effectively, with unlimited numbers of films on it, a sort of cinephile version, if you like, of Netflix. And the second time they nearly went bust, they thought, we've got to throw the original plan away and we'll start again. And they came back with this blazingly simple idea, which is it's a curated service for people who like this kind of world cinema and cinephile experience. It's a new film every day, and the film's only available for 30 days. I've just described you the business. It's as simple as that. It's been incredibly successful.
Yeah.
Now, at its heart, what's so simple about it? From the point of view of the film rights owners, you are getting some extra money that you would never otherwise get. But your film's not being very widely dispersed, so you know exactly how many times it's being seen. You also are learning about audiences around the world for your catalogue, so that's not a bad thing to know. From the point of view of the service itself, it's not very expensive to buy these films. So, and from an audience point of view, it's like saying, okay, somebody's going to take me by the hand. And I think people underestimate the take me by the hand bit. You know, what has made Punch Drunk, everyone here aware of them, the immersive theatre company that started life just down the road?
Yeah.
You know, what's made them so successful is that they take you by the hand in a very particular way in a darkened space, and you have this strange kind of non-narrative theatre experience, and they're enormously successful. You know, their latest show in Shanghai has been running for 2 years.
Oh, really?
2 years. 2 years. Only Cirque du Soleil have had the similar success. So it's fascinating, you know. It's finding that sweet spot.
Yeah, because do we think that cinema can ever have that kind of impact, the same as theatre, in that kind of something running for 2 years in the same place? Is that something that can ever happen?
Well, famously, The Sound of Music, I think, ran for 2 years without interruption in the UK cinemas when it was released. But that was in the days before television had become huge, and certainly home entertainment didn't exist. And I think Debbie's point is, in an environment where you're constantly competing for eyeballs,
Yes.
I think that's really difficult to imagine.
I mean, there are examples. So The Greatest Showman or Mamma Mia, they have their cinema release, and then they have their sing-along releases. So to a certain extent, that is happening.
Yeah.
but
I mean, it
not
was
in
Mamma
the
Mia,
way.
wasn't it? Mamma Mia 1, where I think half the audience went to see the film at least 4 times.
4 times?
Yeah.
That's too many
It was
times.
astonishing, the level of... I mean, how many... That's really odd. I mean, to me, slightly odd, but kind of great for the filmmakers.
Amazing for the filmmakers and Meryl Streep.
Yeah.
But talking about all this, does this mean that if there's a filmmaker in the audience whose dream is to make a 5-hour-long, silent, black and white epic,
Not
that
5 hours.
it's not it's not going to go anywhere because everybody needs to be making something that can be shown in a hot tub on someone's TV screen?
No, I mean, I believe there is an audience for every film. It's not going to be everyone. The filmmakers say, my film's for everyone. I'm like, no, it's not. So there will be an audience for your 5-hour black and white silent film. There was an audience for Hanneke's 3-hour black and white German film, you know, The Artist black and white silent film. So there'll definitely be an audience. It's just the work you need to do.
I mean, Derek Jarman's film when he was dying, what's it called, Blue, was it? You know, which is just the voice and a screen. That's it.
Yeah.
That had an audience, right? The question is, how much did it cost to make? And I think that people forget it's the relationship between the cost and the size of the audience that is really what you're always thinking about.
Yeah.
Punch Drunk didn't find their audience suddenly. They started off with cheap warehouse spaces, and then they found an audience which was only 200 or 300 people, and they grew from there.
Yeah. So the traditional business model of film, is that dead, or does that still exist?
I think it exists in some form, but has changed so dramatically, and there are parties trying to preserve it. So our multiplex cinemas, our larger cinemas, protecting their theatrical window. So if you put a film in one of those bigger cinemas, you can't then release it on DVD or VOD for 16 weeks, so 4 months later, and they're protecting that ferociously. So if you try and break that window, they pull your film from their cinemas. And that famously happened with Night of the Museum too. So they will enforce it. So there is a traditional model as such, but the more unconventional ways are breaking through. So Day and Date is no longer, you know, when I worked at Curse and Artificial Eye, that was a real revolution in how to release a film, the same time in cinemas and on demand. Oh my God, no one will come. But it just showed that people watch it in different ways. They're two different audiences that can come out. But now that's quite a normal way to release a film.
Yeah.
I think there's two ways of looking at it. I think there's, if you looked at the box office, it's a half empty, half full thing. The top 20, this is the top 500 films from the box office in the UK last year. Something that I carry with me at all times.
You don't have it in your mind.
No, I keep trying to memorise it, but the list is too long. We jokingly, Debbie and I do sessions where we play around with, what do you think did well and what did badly. And one way of looking at this is quite demoralising, would be say, the top 20 films probably took 85% of the box office. But it's 85% of a very, very, very large number. So of the other 15%, there's plenty of room for independent voices. The only thing is, are they doing it at the right cost? I think if you looked at huge, macro level stuff about the future of civilization and entertainment, the one thing that I would find slightly worrying is we've gradually, and it's been a slow process, been going on for at least 25 years, moved from a model where you buy a particular thing. I'll have that show, I'll buy that film, I'll buy that piece of music. And we've moved from that slowly into what you'd call a subscription model for everything. And obviously, by that Sky TV was a subscription model for film, which dominated the film landscape here actually in terms of cash. And obviously now you've got big players with subscription services in film, but also very notably in music. So the question of what the relationship is between the independent filmmaker and a subscription service, that question, that's an interesting one for the future.
That's not yet been answered.
No, that will be answered, in the next 20 years.
So we'll come back then.
20 years' time.
Then, yes.
What one hopes will happen is that loads and loads of little niches will end up being catered for. Because, when we said the cinemas, they're still growing in number, and I read out that list of towns, right? And you went, wow, what?
I've never heard of
Well,
something.
the great thing is that, so there's little towns that are having cinemas put in them because there is enough of an audience there to justify that level of cost. Well, hopefully the same will happen in all these subscription services. So Spotify, within its playlists, will not just ever promote the biggest playlists, but will end up with dozens of really beautifully curated indie playlists. That's the battle, where the battle there is commerce, but it's also culture.
Absolutely, and there do exist streaming services and subscription services for different genres of films. You've got movie for sort of more art house and world stuff. There's horror movie subscription services.
There's going to be Disney.
Disney's going to have one.
MGM just launched theirs. I do worry that we're going to get so confused about where to go now for our content, and that there has to be some consolidation because normal people, and I don't class us as normal people.
Just by virtue of the fact that we're here today.
We're here, yes. Yeah, no, you're the exception to the rule. You're going to seek out films, you're going to watch, you're going to consume a lot of content. In the UK, somebody that considers themselves, like a normal person outside of this room, who considers themselves a regular cinema goer, is only going to the cinema 2.85 times a year. So not even going 3 times a year. And to them, they're like, I've got Netflix subscription. Why do I why isn't it on there? Why do I have to now subscribe to Amazon to get what I want? And now I'm paying 2 lots, and now there's Disney over here, and it's not on these channels. So I do think we're going to head towards some sort of consolidation.
Should we find out how normal this audience is?
Yes.
I don't know if you want to know.
How many of you have been to the cinema more than 5 times in the last 12 months?
See, that's mental.
Okay, so
mental.
Not normal.
Not normal.
Weird
people.
audience.
Yeah. And I say that to my students, we are the exception. You are going to, I have film students and, festival goers on my audience as somebody you don't need to work hard to convert. But normal people, we do. We have to work really hard to get them to, off their asses, out the door, into a cinema, paying their money. That takes a lot to get them out there,
At the end of everything, everybody, including everyone in this room, can dream an artistic dream and hope to realise it. I mean, there is technically nothing to stop you. The barriers that did exist are much lower than they were before, than they used to be. Ex-student of mine, Fola O'Reilly, from the producing course, made Lady Macbeth for like £400,000 of public money, and that was really successful pretty much everywhere around the world. And on the back of that, she's about to start shooting a film in 3 weeks' time with Kate Blanchett and Saoirse Ronan. Wow. So that's her path in, and she discovered a star along the way because Florence Pugh is now, a really highly regarded actress. It is absolutely possible, and feature film is just the one area which is probably trickiest because the costs are the highest. Theatre and music, books, publishing, ideas, poetry, those are cheaper because actually making them is cheaper. Other than that, it's really all the same.
Okay, so just to round off before we open up, if you have any questions, for the young people in this room who may be wanting to make films or work on more of the business side, the distribution side, in 10 years' time, we've sort of touched on it, what do we imagine the film and TV business that they'll be entering to look like?
It will still be there.
It'll still be on the big screen.
Okay.
Very, very definitely still be on the big screen. That doesn't seem to be going away at all. It will still have a very big social component.
Okay.
Because I think that's kind of part of why it exists in the first place. People want the social experience. I mean, a legendary film producer who's now in the House of Lords, Lord Putnam, said famously in about 1983 that cinema was going to die, and he's been eating his words ever since. That hasn't happened.
Because we've been saying that for decades.
Yeah.
TV came, cinema's dead. But it's
Home Ends came.
Cinema's dead, but no, it's still
Blockbuster
going.
Video, all gone. At the end of the day, I think it's a bit like saying, nightclubbing will die just because, planning permissions are difficult. And, well, it won't, because the fundamental social activity around music just drives people to want that experience. Even me, when I'm 61 years old, I still want that experience. So, it's totally gettable. That's what I mean about it being culturally driven. At the end of the day, we can talk about the economic models, but what's driving it is some very, very powerful human instincts and emotions.
Okay, lovely. Well, in that case, open it up to you guys. Does anyone have any questions at all? We have a microphone.
If you don't, we shoot you.
This abnormal crowd.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks for coming. Very nice talk. You were talking before about the many choices we have, Netflix, Amazon, and how it might affect our decision to go to the cinema. But I read that people who have those subscriptions are actually more likely to go to cinema than people who don't. So that 2.85 you were talking about is actually something like 5 for people who have Netflix accounts. What do you think about that? Have you seen that happening?
That people who subscribe also go to the cinema.
I think it's a good thing in terms of it's getting people consuming content. I think it's what they go to the cinema to see, and that's the thing we've seen a shift in. Audiences for film are getting older, so audiences in cinema are getting older. It's the younger audiences that know that they can stay at home and watch a film on Netflix, or who are prepared to wait for certain films to be out of the cinema and then on their TVs. For the bigger blockbuster Hollywood films, that's where the younger audiences are still coming to cinemas. So, I mean, you're right, it's a good thing in terms of consuming content, getting to know the cast that are in the Netflix and Amazon films. So when they are in the cinema, their profiles are higher and people are more likely to come out. So there is a positive story there, but we still have to work hard on getting you guys, not you because you're not normal, but your age range of audiences into cinemas to see independent film.
I think there's one other observation, which is if you think about the economics of subscription services now, they are incredibly cheap. Yeah. And they're not just incredibly cheap because it feels cheap. They are actually economically very cheap. Wall Street does not believe that subscription services can carry on being this cheap forever. Yeah. They are absolutely assuming that the share price of the companies involved, Netflix for example, is dependent on the prices growing quite sharply once the audience is big enough. So at the moment it's all about creating audience share, and then it will be about growing the price. At the point when the price goes, because it has to justify all the investment that's been put in, at that point the price choice you make between a subscription service and a cheap ticket on a Tuesday afternoon at the cinema will become slightly more balanced. At the moment it feels sort of weirdly out of shape with each other.
You can see that in Netflix's strategy. So it's all about getting subscribers. They are a business. They're not in it for the love of film. They're in it to control all of your lives and souls. So they're actively looking for audiences they don't have. So they're doing a project with David Attenborough, Our Planet. So they're going to get that kind of documentary, natural history audience, which is huge. They realise they didn't have that. They're going after
and they've
kids.
Just announced they're moving into the theatre world as well.
Oh, really? Yeah, so they're going to get all of you, sell your souls, you've got the subscription, you can't live without it, and then the price is going up. It's already gone up £1, hasn't it? And that's going to creep up.
Those slow creeps, really, they get you, but I guess it is an economical thing, where tickets for the cinema are £15 on a Wednesday and a peak time.
Well, Leicester Square is going up to, they've got £40 tickets.
But interestingly, we are in a bit of a London bubble here. If you look at average cinema ticket price for 2018, the stats do not lie. The average for all tickets averaged out £7.70.
Yeah. And there's a cinema in Scotland I read this week in Stirling that's doing like 3-tier ticket pricing. So you can choose what you pay for your ticket. You can pay £4.50 or you can pay £8.50. No questions asked. So
there's a fabulous book I'd recommend to anyone who's interested in this stuff, and it's not as dry as it sounds, called The Curve, by a really interesting guy called Nicholas Lovell, and it's about price. It's about what we think something's worth and what you want to pay for it, and what happens if you make something free and then just say to people, but you can pay, what would you pay? And you end up with quite small chunks of the audience paying a lot more than you would expect in many areas, notably in games. The games world is actually a world where pricing has been played with a lot. There's a company called Green Man Gaming that do nothing but strategize around bundling games at different price points that move all the time because they can find an audience. Cinema in that way is quite not dinosaur-like, but sort of late to the party.
Do we have any more questions? Oh, tons.
Oh, great.
We obviously said something.
We'll come again. We'll come again.
Down to the front. We've got these two gents here.
Hi there. So recently Netflix brought out a film called Bandersnatch, which was interactive.
Yep.
Do you think that there's any potential for that to be in cinema or to take place in cinema?
It's already happening. So we're sort of playing around with that. There's a documentary called The Boy in the Book, and the audiences vote for which direction.
outcomes.
Yeah, so there's a guy hosting it. It was done almost as a live cinema event where it was compared by the guy in the documentary hosting it, and he finds a photo in a book that he's bought, and it's sort of trying to track down who it is, and the audience vote for who he goes to speak to next and what his decisions are. From a filmmaking point of view, it's a real feat of engineering because you have to have all the different avenues. But from an audience point of view, you could watch that maybe 16 times and watch a different film each time. And as a model, it was really interesting because people were coming in groups and then arguing with each other because the results come up and they felt really strongly that he should have spoken to that person and they didn't, or they were coming on their own and then having these conversations with people afterwards. So to replicate that as a cinema release has you know, a lot of implications in terms of how we do it, but it really worked on those instances. Yeah.
I think it's also part of that wider thing about immersion and engagement. You know, going to an immersive theatre show is not about being told a story, it's about finding a story in the journey you take. So I do think there's something there about the culture, it's not just about the commerce.
Cinema as experience.
Yeah.
Again. Yeah. Do you want to pass the mic just to...
Give it to me.
Yeah.
So my question was about trends in cinema. And I know at the moment we're kind of coming off the peak of a superhero trend. I was wondering if you maybe had any predictions about what the next genre trend would be?
Ooh, any insight?
I'd like to feel
I
that
suspect that whatever the forward path is, given the level of production cost for the films that hit the top 10, it will continue to be established properties that have already proven their way in, let's say, the books or comic world or TV or in some other way, because effectively the production risk is now so enormous that you have to have had a trailer, if you like, to find out, to pathfind the audience. I suspect that's not going to change. One of the things I wish would happen, and it might, maybe it will, is that we'll have a year where 4 low-budget films come along and score absolutely unbelievable results. That hasn't happened for really quite a long time.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't remember the last time a film that cost less than £1 million really was a huge hit.
Because we've been dominated by 50 Shades of Grey and Marvel.
Yeah.
But I'm encouraged by the trends. You know, audiences coming out for female-driven product, for colour. So I really, I see that being not a trend, hopefully, but something that continues to increase.
Any other questions? Can we go to, there's a blonde person, 1, 2, 3, 4, yes, waving their hand.
Right in the middle.
You just wait for the mic, just in case.
One panel I did, the microphone was in a cube, like a sponge cube, and you threw it to the person. Yeah.
Great.
We need to get those here.
Hi, I'm a writer, and I was just wondering, we were talking about the genre labelling, and I was just wondering what your points of view on the genre labelling. Do you think it could affect creative experimentation in terms of limiting writers and creatives? Will it start becoming too specific? Will people start worrying about going between genres, or do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes. Yeah. I think from a distribution and marketing point of view, the genre is a very powerful tool to get the message across about a film, and I would say the genre is very important in our marketing message. So we're not changing the actual genre of the film, if that makes sense. So I would wholly welcome experimentation with genres, in between genres, different genres, but to market to an audience, I need to be quite clear about what the film is, so the audience know what they're getting. So in that respect, I would pull out one or maybe two of the genres as a key message, but that wouldn't affect how the film is made.
If somebody comes and says it's a psychological comedy horror thriller, you just know that you're probably not going to have a great experience. Right? I mean, and everyone's giggling because we're all kind of on the same page, aren't we? So I think but you know, audience. So you have to. I think there's two sides to this. You have to be honest with yourself about what it is you're making, but then I think you can play with it. Has anyone here seen a film called Under the Shadow, Babak Anwari's film?
Yes.
Anyone seen that? I mean, I think that's an absolutely exceptional piece of work. I think it's not been seen in the cinemas because it only released in the UK and then it was bought by...
It was on Netflix.
Netflix bought the world, basically. So the film was a totally independent film. Netflix bought the world, and it's done very well on Netflix. British-Iranian filmmaker, film set in Tehran during the Iran-Iraq war, rockets raining down on the city. It's entirely set in an apartment block where a woman and her kids are left behind. The husband's gone off to the battlefront. And it's a ghost story, really.
Yeah, it's kind of a...
But it's much more than that. So I think there's some genres are more forgiving than others. I mean, ghost stories, for example, can be really, really multifaceted and complex. I think it's quite hard to mess around with the audience expectations for a horror movie. I think audiences have a specific view of what is and isn't horror.
Yeah, I've failed with projects that have been not horror enough, sort of horror and art house, but not art house enough for the art house audience, and not horror enough for the horror audience, and they fall down the middle. And I think the worst thing you can do is sort of confuse your audience when you're marketing. So I would be very clear about this is a genre, and we're not mis-selling the film, we're just pulling out, like I say, something to focus the audience on so they know what they're getting. I did a case study yesterday on We Need to Talk About Kevin by Lynn Ramsey, which is sort of a very
which
indie...
you marketed.
Yes, very indie interpretation of a harrowing story. But in the marketing, there was a huge audience in the readers of the book. Over 1 million people in the UK had read the book. And there are thriller elements in that. There are horror elements in that. And that's what we chose to bring out in the marketing. So we're not changing the film, but we're finding the message and the genre to bring audiences to it. So the clearer you can be about what your film is, the better. Does that answer your question?
I mean, it's a question we wrestle with. I mean, just to reassure you, it's a question we wrestle with every day at the school because we're making films all the time. And so our producing and writing and directing students are constantly asking themselves that question. There are many people like you thinking that question, and you're not alone.
Anyone who was... can we go up in just this guy at the back here? Yeah.
Hi, you spoke about independent filmmakers and distribution and all the different routes into the kind of scene. My question was, what's your opinion on using YouTube as a platform to establish yourself?
Establish yourself
in the industry through your film. So put your film on YouTube or whatever it is you make initially to kind of establish maybe a fan base, an audience.
Yeah, so I think you're spot on about the audience. So you need to be very clear who your audience is. And I always have this kind of epiphany moment with filmmakers, and sometimes they really hate me. You may not be the audience for your own film. And I sit them down, give them a shot of vodka to really sit with that.
Bottle of rosé.
Yes, I'll have the bottle of rosé. But if you're a 20-year-old guy and you're making a film that appeals to 35-year-old women, you are not the audience for your film. So what you respond to in a trailer or a poster or those things is not going to be the same. So you kind of have to put yourself out of it. And if you're watching your films on YouTube or on your tablet, your audience might not be. They might be cinema goers. So be really clear about who the audience is for your film and if YouTube is the right platform. And if you feel it is, I think it's a very powerful platform. The only thing is the work then to drive people to it because of the sheer amount of different content on YouTube and reasons people are not necessarily going there to seek film. They're going for cat videos or...
Well, 70% of the traffic now is driven by music.
Yeah. So that is the challenge with YouTube. If you're going onto a platform like Distrify or Mubi, people are going there to consume films, or Vimeo, so it's easier then to convert them. But YouTube is ever powerful, I think, if you can get that bit right.
I mean, Debbie, do you think it's fair to say that one might talk about Vimeo being the place where the film lives and YouTube being the place where you promote it?
Yes, yeah, that you could use YouTube as part of a bigger promotion along with other social media channels. That could definitely be a model.
Interesting. Who else had a question? Anyway, just down here on the in the check shirt.
Hi there. Could you just talk a little bit about the market for short films and the economics of that and how you could make that work and that kind of stuff?
I'm afraid it's sort of non-economics, really. I'm sorry to say. I mean, obviously, there is some... Look, there is a festival circuit live for films, and there is a kind of online live for films, and shorts and a few other syndicators, Movie Partnership and others. You know, there is some syndication revenue to be had. It's hugely dependent on festival performance, and therefore critical response to single out the material from what is, you know, vast production of... If you think of every film school in the world, you know, we make 32 a year, just us. So now multiply that by every film school in the galaxy.
A lot of film.
Then add every non-film school filmmaker. You know, I'm sorry to say I don't really have much advice other than festival lead, syndication second.
Yeah, I think short films are still very much your calling card as a filmmaker. This is what I'm capable of. Here's an amazing script and a bit of a package. Here's what I've done before. And then it sort of takes a bit of the risk away if we can see, oh, you've made some really strong shorts. When we're looking at a feature, you know, we get to know your style. As Chris, you were saying, another strategy is to do a short version of the feature film and tour that around festivals and start building your audiences. I've worked on a few films, and that's been a great way of showing that there's an audience and also demonstrating you can do the work.
I mean, I didn't mean to sound dismissive, by the way. I think it's a real challenge. I mean, I've just exec-produced a short written and directed by an old friend of mine called Starboy, which has just started playing the festival circuit, about a kid within the Hasidic Jewish community who discovers he's trans, and it's a 12-minute, 13-minute short, but it's been built in such a way that it unfolds into a feature film as the full story. Joel's written the script, and so the catch now is, was the short good enough for her to get the commission that will make the feature? And, you know, I don't know the answer to that yet. I'll tell you in 6 months' time.
I mean, there could be in the future, like with Facebook's channels, Snapchat originals, you know, those are going to be short form content. So, you know, there might be some future avenues on those platforms.
Was it, you're thinking of standalone shorts, right, rather than thematic or narratively?
Like a web series or something.
Is it still worth making shorts? Is there, what's the work involved?
Well, how else is anyone going to find you, in a way?
Yeah, it's a profile builder. It's examples of your work. So I think it's definitely worth.
Also, feature film is a huge undertaking.
Yes.
If you are an emerging filmmaker, to get, as you said, they're hugely expensive. You need massive teams a lot of the time. So if you want to start with a feature film, I guess it's highly unlikely. Yeah. Does that answer your question? There was somebody else. I saw a hand earlier that was also down this end. Yes, just down in the second. Should we wait for the microphone? And then we might have more time for one more after.
It kind of follows on a little bit from like the previous question. So you did answer like a lot of the sort of points that I might have raised. But I was going to say, do you think there's a possibility of like the emergence of like in a cinema like experience. So like, you know, you get Pixar's and their short films before their main features. Do you think there's a possible future for like live action, so not animation, so live action shorts playing before a main feature? I'm not saying it happen right now, but do you think that's a possibility?
Curzon, sorry, I'm going to have a coughing fit. Curzon actually do that, thank you. Curzon do play short films, but there's no, you know, they're not acquiring those films, so there's no kind of financial transactions. It's purely to support the filmmakers. So there are exhibitors and distributors doing that.
I mean, there's an odd footnote to history here, if anyone wants a tiny history. Until about 1979, 1980, shorts were a regular feature of every cinema programme in the UK. There was only one reason for that, which was there was a subsidy system called the ED levy in place. And basically, every ticket that you bought, part of that went into funding British material, and it funded the production of scores, hundreds in fact, of shorts. Many of them were terrible. So there was an industry making shorts that played before features. Take that away, Maggie Thatcher took away the subsidy. It was one of the first subsidies that she removed from the economic system. And all of that stuff fell away. But it's quite interesting, because if you think about it, now speaking with my cinema owner hat on, if I was still there, I'd go, I put a short on, that's going to reduce the amount of time I can do other things, like play the feature, sell ice creams, etc. So the economics of it are not obvious. That's the only thing. It would be done for cultural reasons, not economic reasons.
Interesting.
But I can imagine people paying to go and watch a selection of great short films as a thing in itself. That I can imagine.
Some of which we're screening this afternoon, actually, at 3 o'clock. So make sure you're there. We have time for one more question, I think, if anyone has a last burning one in the audience.
Pressure.
No pressure. This weird audience.
Yay! Heroic.
You have to make it a good one.
With the with sort of Disney bringing out their streaming service next year, do you see that there could be like an oversaturation of streaming services that could sort of bring it all sort of crashing down, or on the flip side, that one sort of monopolise all scenario? Which one do you think it would probably go down?
I mean, that's what I was alluding to before about the audiences not understanding why their content isn't, you know, the film that they're after isn't on Netflix. Now they have to buy Amazon subscription, and Disney and HBO they're going to do the same. So I think consolidation that's what's going to happen. There's going to be one place you go with the different channels. You pay one price to access 6 or 7 of those, but they're branded the Disney Channel, Netflix, Amazon. That's what I think. But that's definitely where we're heading.
Yeah. And just before we let you go, one last thing for me. What excites you about the film and TV business at the moment? What is going to happen that is just really exciting, that's keeping you loving the industry that you're working in?
I think it's that there's some fabulous writing, and I think if just take End of the Fucking World, Babak Anwari's film that I was talking about earlier on, some of the stuff our students do. You know, at the end of the day, ideas, whether it's for a play or for a experimental theatre piece, or whether it's for a small film or a low-budget feature, you know, what's the cost of actually having the ideas? The cost of a pencil and a paper, you know. And there's some fabulous writing going on. It's fabulous writing. I think I think that's something that's come out of Britain being actually culturally a really interesting place. You know, because it's multicultural, because the music scene has been so vibrant for so long, because people don't think of having to adhere to a particular model. So I think there's lots of different kinds of stuff bubbling through. And that, to me, is the beginning of a journey. And the journey might lead you to theatre, it might lead you to short film, it might lead to Netflix commission. You can't tell when you start. That's the exciting bit.
Yeah. For me, it's about this long overdue awakening of the power of audiences. Like, you are in charge. We've seen it with older audiences, the 55 pluses. I mean, who would have thought they, you know, have social time and money? I mean, shock horror, and content's being created for them. And female audiences and people of colour. You know, the audience are in charge of how you consume your content, and that's a power that the industry is recognising now. So it's all to play for in terms of vying for your custom, basically. So that has an impact on the content, it has an impact on the platforms, it has an impact on windows, so when, how and where you can consume content. And that's what I'm excited about, to see how that unfolds and where we end up.
Great. Well, I hope, as you are, just like me, as excited about where we'll be in the future, where you'll be in the future, in this kind of exciting, weird business that everyone wants to work in.
And growing. I think
and
that's
growing.
It's, you know, it's getting bigger and bigger. That's the really, really underlying good news economically from your point of view.
Yeah. So just join me in thanking Chris, Auty, and Debbie Rowland from the NFTS. Thank you.
And thank you for great questions.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I believe you guys have a break now before the next session's at 1:30. So do pop down to the atrium, get some tea and coffee, check out the stuff that's going on, and enjoy the rest of your day.